Well, now you can see these dots starting to connect property, the economy. Now we're going to take a shift, and some of you might wonder why the shift goes that way, but by the time Michael Chapman is finished, you'll understand, because he's going to talk about sustainable development, connecting the dots to your child's classroom. I think that Michael Chapman is the foremost expert in this nation on the connection of the dots between what goes on in your child's classroom and the implementation of sustainable development. You must understand this connection in order to understand how this vile policy is being enforced at every level of our society. And there's no one better to tell you that than Michael Chapman. Are you ready?
Well, welcome to Freedom 21 again. I've been here several times before, and as you can see by my title here, I want to connect the dots this year towards defining sustainable development and how it affects education policy in America. But notice I put sustainable development in quotations because, as most of you are aware by now, it has absolutely nothing to do with sustaining development. It has everything to do with arresting development for the purpose of sustaining the earth and transferring, of course, control to the government, as we've seen. But it's important to understand that you can't build a new house until the old house has been torn down. I've done a lot in previous Freedom 21 conferences on showing you exactly what sustainable development looks like in the curriculum. This year, I decided I wanted to show you how the dots are connected to the removal of our own heritage. But first, I do want to connect it to education policy. As most of you know, we are in the decade of education for sustainable development. Third year into that decade, UNESCO is the global school board that has been given the lead in this project, and this is important because they have told us that their goal is to integrate sustainable development into all levels of education in order to promote education as a key agent for change. Now that's important to the United States because, as Michael Shaw told us, that we have rejoined UNESCO, and President Bush has declared that their mission is our mission. So we need to understand what UNESCO's mission is and what it looks like and how it affects education policy. I want to go back to 1987, the UN World Commission on Environment and Development that published this report on our common future. What you find beyond the marketing language definition of what sustainable development means, as Michael pointed out, that is preserving future resources for future generations. What you find out is, by this report, that involves a progressive transformation of the economy and society. It also includes international interdependence along with enforced community controls. Now, I should tell you that Joy and I, who have worked with EdWatch up in Minnesota for years, have recently moved to Albuquerque, where we happily live in a planned community as squatters on government property. This really is Albuquerque. I was stunned to see your red map there, but it's absolutely true. You can't buy a house in Albuquerque that's new unless it's in a planned community. And we were just notified shortly before I left for this conference that some tribunal somewhere has declared I can't park my own car in front of my house on my street. It's incredible the amount of control that goes into this, and I plan to get involved and find out and dig to the bottom of that as soon as possible. It also, by the way, includes a redistribution, less material and more equitable growth. There again, sustainable development has nothing to do with sustaining development. It has to do with arresting development for the sustaining or equitable distribution of wealth. It has to do with ensuring a sustainable level of population, as Michael touched on. One of the Michaels, I am the third Michael. Merging the environment and economics in decision making. again, through government partnerships. A new ethic that will include a relationship between man and nature above all. This is what Michael alluded to as the pantheistic religion that is the basis of the spiritual sustainable development of all our citizens. Well, back in '87, the member of the commission that represented the United States was a man named William Ruckelshaus. Anybody recognize that name? Yeah, a lot of you do in this crowd. He, of course, was the first Environmental Protection Agency director to that new department, named in '71 through '73. Later, he became President Clinton's appointee to the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And he currently is the chairman of something called World Resources Institute. Well, as the appointee to the President's Council on Sustainable Development, he helped put together this 1994 report called An Education Program to Transform America, where they actually talk about a program for change and declare that educators today face a compelling responsibility to serve society by fostering the transformations needed to set us on the path to sustainable development. The time has come to ensure that the concepts of education for sustainability, in the broadest sense, are discussed and woven into the framework upon which current and future education policy is based. In other words, this was to be the agenda. This was the report that was going to tell how it should be done. Look how this works through consensus process building among NGOs. It says that the North American Association for Environmental Education worked with, guess who, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and World Resources Institute, both run by our friend William Ruckelshaus, who also helped distribute the report. Now keep in mind that this is using taxpayer dollars to fund an NGO to build consensus on which way education policy should go. Now, if that isn't a good definition of taxation without representation, I don't know what is. We did not get to vote for any of these entities. And yet, they tell us that when consensus has been achieved, application will be made to the National Education Goals Panel for certification of the environmental education standards as national standards. Does anybody recognize who the National Education Goals Panel is? That's the organization that, of course, gave us Goals 2000, and also named the non-government organizations that would write America's standards policy, including the National Standards for History, declared as part of the Goals 2000 agenda. That includes, of course, the National Standards for Civics and Government, based on the National Education Goals Panel, Goals 2000. That also includes the National Content Standards for Economics, for Social Studies. In fact, every subject in America today has a curriculum standard that was written as a result of the Sustainable Development Recommendations for Education Policy. Now, I apologize again to those of you who've heard enough of this woman, but this was, again, Dr. Shirley McCune, who spoke at the National Governors Association Conference on Education back in '89 and told us exactly what the agenda was to be.
It seems to me that far too much of our efforts have been focused on the issue of let's find a short-term fix and fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society. What is happening in America today and what is happening in Kansas and the Great Plains is not simply a chance situation in the usual winds of change. What it amounts to is a total transformation of our society. And the issue for most children and the issues for the society is that what has changed in education today is that we no longer see the teaching of facts and information as the primary outcome of education. We have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is, and then move back and figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of schools.
Now keep in mind what we're hearing here is the fact that knowing that this was the future agenda for today, we have been retrofitting our citizens beginning in their earliest years of education to accept these ideas and embrace them as they became education policy. You see, the enemy has circled around behind us and started raising its army against us, and they are our own children. That's the importance of understanding what education in America today has become. I say has become past tense because all 50 states have embraced these policies since 1994, and actually embraced even deeper through No Child Left Behind, the agenda to hold states and local schools accountable now to these standards. Now, the first thing Shirley McCune talked about was the purpose to transform rather than preserve America, and none better than the social studies textbook to explain that, where it says that it is clear that the dominant social, economic, cultural, and scientific trends that have defined the Western world for 5 centuries is leading in new directions. Now, that's what Michael, when you put that quote up about Western civilization from that 94 document, this struck me as exactly what this document for social studies is saying. Western civilization is past. It's over. It's done. We have new ideas we want to put in place now. And it says, therefore, the primary purpose of social studies is to help young people develop the ability to make informed and reasoned decisions for the public good, there's your common good, as citizens of a culturally diverse, democratic society in an interdependent world. There is a goal. We no longer teach history for the sake of history. We now teach social outcome-based studies for the purpose of transforming our children and getting them to embrace these new ideas. In fact, you see now that the NGOs are forming left and right. This is a document, the Education for Sustainable Development Toolkit, published out of the University of Tennessee, that told us that generally more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower income. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. Is this a deliberate dumbing down for the purpose of preserving our nation's resources rather than for developing resources? I think the evidence is in. The book also then tells us what we do need, and that is the development of a global ethic for sustainable development. World citizenship encompasses the constellations of principles, values, attitudes, and behavior that the people of the world must embrace if sustainable development is to be realized. How do you measure whether or not this curriculum is working? You have to throw out something we used to call objective testing and embrace the idea of assessing value. And now, before I go there, let me show you one more NGO that I've just come across in the last few years, and that is a program called Global Classrooms, which are now aligned to our national standards. Now, this is the Sustainable Development Teacher's Guide unit, and it explains that it's based on Goals 2000. In fact, the Teacher's Guide actually compares the global curriculum agenda with our own standards to show you how they are one and the same. It does the work for me. I don't have to even dig it out to show you. But the bottom line here is that Global Classrooms is a standard-based curriculum that aligns to the national, state, and even local standards. We hear a lot about the alignment of our standards and assessments. Folks, when you're aligned with something, you are on the exact same road it's on. And this is telling us that the Global Sustainable Development Agenda is in alignment down to the local school level through our national policy. And it is 100% done and in place today. This tells us that this particular unit focuses on 6 of the 21 sustainable development items contained in Agenda 21. So again, you've connected the dots between Agenda 21, sustainable development, national policy, and our local school curriculum. By the way, Global Classrooms has U.S. State Department support. They fund it, and Condoleezza Wright gave the keynote speech at the 2005 conference in Washington, D.C., where the leaders of the future UN model students were there to compete. She told us that I think Global Classrooms is a wonderful program, and I'm glad that you're all involved in it. It also gives you an opportunity to see what it might be like to have a future in public service. In other words, a UN model future in public service. Just amazing. Now again, we have to throw out objective testing and replace them with assessments. What do we assess besides our children today? We assess our property for value. We assess our car for how much it's worth so we know how much to pay on our tax. We now assess your children to determine how well they have conformed and will be valuable to this future new society. Now, No Child Left Behind made it a federal offense to show you the National Assessment of Educational Progress, but I can show you the results and the documents that publish those kind of results. It tells us that now government economic-related policy or economic-related government responsibilities includes keeping prices under control. This is considered a correct answer. 84.2% of ninth graders now believe it's government's responsibility to set prices. 63.5% now believe it's government's responsibility to reduce differences in income and wealth among people. In other words, the redistribution of wealth. You see, the curriculum is working as it's meant to work because it's now showing that our children are now answering more in the direction of the socialist system of economics, including providing an adequate standard of living for the unemployed, government's responsibility. Where did these assessments come from? They came through an international consensus that now says that as a result, the assessment items in Civ Ed were not designed to measure knowledge of a particular country's government, but were developed instead to measure knowledge and understanding of key principles that are universal across democracies. Now, this is incredible to me because these are supposed to be the concepts that are universal across democracies. Well, certainly not in America, are they? So how in the world is it possible to get children to believe these kind of things? Well, Lenin once said, take away a people's heritage and they're easily persuaded. Now that's what where I kind of want to go with a little bit of time here that I have left, and that is to talk about the censorship of our heritage in order to prepare the ground to plant these seeds in the minds of our children. We've all experienced a lot of this, but there have been a number of recent studies conducted to show just how much our history knowledge is lacking in America. For example, a study from the Elite College History sponsored by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni did a study and found that only 23% of college seniors at the 50 top universities in America, only 23% were able to name James Madison as the father of the Constitution. 54% thought it was Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't even in the country during the formation of the Constitution. Only 34% correctly identified George Washington as the American general at Yorktown, and yet 72% did know that Joseph Stalin was the Soviet leader during World War II, and at the same time only 35% knew that Harry Truman was president during the Korean War. Another finding, only 22% could name the source of the phrase government of the people, by the people, and for the people as the Gettysburg Address. 22%. Now these are college seniors from our most elite universities. Only 22% even understand the concept, let alone where it came from. Most amazing, the study found that there was virtually no difference between every senior and those seniors who were actually taking history as a course of study. Absolutely no difference. And yet, to me, the most fundamental questions weren't even asked on these studies, like what form of government are we? You know, we all talk about being a democracy, but Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution guarantees we'll never become a democracy. Our founders called it a mobocracy for one reason and one reason only, because they recognized that the most famous democratic vote in all of history was crucify Christ. The crowd had spoken. The government even knew he was innocent and yet followed the will of the people. That's pure democracy. And that's why our founders gave us Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, guarantee we would never make that same mistake. Here's another question I would have liked to see on the test. What is the primary source of ideas for America's republic? You know, we hear a lot about the Greek philosophers and the Enlightenment. I even find answers in the textbook that say we actually came from the Iroquois Confederacy. It's amazing the garbage we're finding. But the absolute truth of the fact is that the Bible was the primary source of our founders' ideas. In fact, I became a rare book collector because I didn't believe it at first, because I'd never been taught this in our history. Well, this is a history textbook from Noah Webster in 1835, and he told us that it's the sincere desire of the writer that our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct Republican principles is the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Christian religion. Now understand, this is not a doctrinal mandate that you believe the Christian doctrine. This is simply an understanding of where our founders gleaned the ideas for representative Republican government. And I want to show you exactly why that is, because it's so important to understand that this is not a force of religion. This is a historic fact of understanding where the ideas for our formation came from. Now, the textbook version talks about the roots of government as being from the Enlightenment. Here, the Enlightenment thinkers were excited to have an entirely new government based on Enlightenment principles. Now, no textbook is required to give footnotes. In fact, you rarely see a footnote anywhere in a textbook explaining where they get their facts from. But this particular textbook actually did explain where they got that fact from. They cited a study of 15,000 political writings published in America between 1760 and 1805, and a tally of the authors most often quoted by our founders was made. And they found that it was led by Baron de Montesquieu, a French philosopher. David Hume and John Locke were the next two runners-up. It explains that all three were part of the Enlightenment, and therefore our ideas for government came from the Enlightenment. Now, they said that that this was all part of the Age of Reason, that says that people have natural rights that belong to them as a condition of being human. Well, the very first thing you'll notice that is if that is what our founders believed to be true, they would not have written in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. In other words, our founders saw the ideas totally opposite of the Age of Reason. The idea that our rights came inherently from a Creator God who gave them and endowed us with those rights. Now, actually, the study that they cite was published by Donald Lutz in this book back in 1988. And yes, you do find that Montesquieu was the top quoted source, but Blackstone was second, not Hume. Now, why in the world would they jump over William Blackstone? Well, if you've studied law in this country, you've studied Sir William Blackstone. He was the author of the Commentaries on the Law of England and became the basis for our law in America. In fact, Thomas Jefferson quoted him as the origin of the laws of nature and of nature's God. He quoted Blackstone in the Declaration of Independence. Well, Blackstone defines the law of nature as the will of God. He goes on to explain that this law of nature is dictated by God himself. It is, of course, superior in obligation to any other law. It is binding over all the globe in all countries and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this. This is the definition of natural law as given to America by Sir William Blackstone. Now, he says no human law is even valid if contrary to this. Now, that's important to understand because it was the violation of our natural law rights that caused the founders to write the Declaration of Independence and list the 26 grievances and ways that the King of England had violated natural law. Of course, that is censored not only from our children, but from this study as well, and from our law curriculum. But it's all good law is based on this one. In fact, the law of personal security comes from Exodus 20. Protection against slander and false accusation, property rights, the right to inheritance, the right to the fruit of one's own labor, the prohibition on exploitation of the weak, fair trial, free access to the courts. Nobody is above the law, not even kings. Now, you would understand that from Samuel Rutherford. Where did he get the idea? The same place our founders got the idea. The original source of those ideas for freedom. The Bible. Now, Locke and Montesquieu were also considered theologians. In fact, the study itself concludes that when it came to building and running civil societies, few American Whigs of the 1770s saw any conflict between what they read in Locke or Montesquieu and what they read in the Bible. This, of course, has to be censored. But most amazing of all is that the Bible itself, the study showed, was quoted over 34% of the time, more than double the top 3 individual sources combined. You see, social outcome-based study simply censors facts that get in the way of the social outcome-based agenda. In fact, the study showed that although the citations from our founders came from virtually every part of the Bible, St. Paul was the favorite in the New Testament, especially the parts of his epistles to the Romans in which he discusses the basis for and limits on obedience to political authorities. Keep that in mind, because that has to be thrown out. Why is Christian roots of government censored? Because they stand in the way of transforming America under a new idea of government where government is in control and in charge of our rights, and we owe obedience to none but the arbiter of our rights, government. That's why this stuff has to be censored from our children's minds through education. Well, where is the Bible and the Constitution? I get this all the time. Well, if our founders were so religious or Christian, where in the world is the citations from the Bible and the Constitution? Well, how about the 3 branches of government that came from Isaiah 33:22? Or Article 1, Section 8, the Uniform Immigration Laws that came from Leviticus 19:34? Or Article 2, Section 1, that the president must be a natural-born citizen from Deuteronomy 17:15? Or Article 3, Section 3, witness and capital punishment and provision against attainder from Deuteronomy 17 and Ezekiel 18. Or how about Article 4, Section 4, that we are a republican form of government, the idea of which came from Exodus 18. You see, the ideas were known at the time to be from the Bible. We didn't have to cite the source. We just codified it into law to put in play the principles contained in our national charter, the Declaration of Independence, that my colleague Alan Quist will be talking about on Friday. Now, a French historian who was actually living in part of the Enlightenment came to America to find out why our revolution succeeded where France's had failed, and wrote a book called The Republic of the United States of America that, of course, has been translated to The Democracy in America. He told us that the Americans combined the notions of Christianity and of liberty so intimately in their minds that it's impossible to make them conceive the one without the other. That has to be censored from the minds of our children for obvious reasons. Now, what about separation of church and state? There's been a lot of good documentation on this. I'm not going to go into this deeply. I just want you to understand that where it's supposed to be coming from is the First Amendment. And you notice that the First Amendment starts with a prohibition against what Congress shall not do. Congress shall make no law. You see, that's where it began. The Bill of Rights was not an enumeration of our rights. It was a limitation on government's power. Now, our founders did not want a church-controlled state, nor did they want a state-controlled church. They wanted to keep the two functions of those institutions separate. The church is not supposed to maintain a standing army. Neither is the government supposed to take over the function of the church. That is the real concept and understanding of the separation of those duties. It is a separation of duties, not a principled divorce of the ideas of government. We are one nation under God, meaning all of our institutions derive all of their authority from that single source. You want to find out what the function of the church is? Read the Bible. You want to find out what the function of government is? Read the Bible. Government don't do what the church is supposed to do. Churches don't do what the government's supposed to do. That is the separation of church and state that we have to get back to understanding in order to dispel the arguments and the myth that somehow we are to be free of all religious influence. Jefferson himself, who gave us that phrase as an answer to the Danbury Baptist concern that we were about to name a national church, has also, in reference to slavery, told us, God who gave us life gave us liberty. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I realize that God is just and his justice cannot sleep forever. Man, what words from the least religious of our founding fathers. In fact, Daniel Webster argued a case in the Supreme Court for a private school who wanted to eliminate the teaching of biblical principles. This is his decision. This is the unanimous decision of the court backing up Daniel Webster's defense of the Christian faith being taught in schools. He concluded by saying, I have shown that the Christian religion, its general principles must ever be regarded among us as the foundation of civil society. Why don't we hear the court citing this law, this decision of the Supreme Court? Because they don't want to, do they? George Washington, in his farewell address, told us of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. In fact, the founders saw this as so important, they codified it into the law back under the Constitution by passing the Northwest Ordinance on August 7, 1789, requiring that religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. I want to just touch briefly on those three pillars and explain why they are so important. The first pillar, religion, according to our founders, the foundation of law, liberty, and justice. This is probably why you see Moses holding the Ten Commandments over the East Portico of the Supreme Court building. You also see the Ten Commandments built into the oak chamber doors and looking down at the Supreme Court bench from high above the bench. All the other lawgivers in history are all looking at Moses. Moses alone is looking down at the Supreme Court bench. What does that tell you about what the architects of the Supreme Court building recognize about the foundation of law, liberty, and justice in America? In fact, one of my favorite public school textbooks is this Citizen's Manual from New York that explains in a series of questions and answers back in 1867, is there a higher law than the Constitution? The Constitution is the highest human law, but the law of God is the highest of all laws. To whom are the representatives responsible? To the people and to God. What does the Bible say respecting magistrates? It commands us to obey magistrates. But suppose their commands come in conflict with the law of God, which, by the way, include our natural, unalienable rights. Then we ought to obey God rather than men. We used to teach this to our children, folks. The book goes on. Now you've all heard, well, are you just trying to legislate your morality? Anybody heard that? What law has ever been passed that didn't define right and wrong behavior? How do you define morality? It's not a question of can you legislate morality, it's a question of whose morality are we to legislate. The book answers these questions too. Do laws which restrain a man from doing wrong infringe on his liberty? They do not, for he has no right to do wrong. Profoundly simple if you believe in the difference between right and wrong. If you believe in an absolute standard by which all men are accountable to, that is higher than man himself. That is the definition of perfect law. And the book actually tells us if one was free to do right and secure against wrong, what would he have? Perfect liberty. Profoundly simple, and that's why this nation has survived longer than any other constitution known to man throughout the history of time. This nation has survived with one piece of paper because it was born from the original source of all of human life. Well, the second pillar is very similar, morality, the foundation of self-government. This is a quotation carved in the marble over the United States Department of Justice that tells us justice in the life and conduct of the state is possible only as it first resides in the hearts and souls of the citizens. Now, folks, history has been full of failed democracies. Why did it survive here? Well, our founders tell us why. It was the great experiment in self-government. Benjamin Franklin said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. You see, when we lose the capacity for self-government, we have more need of police on the streets to maintain order, don't we? If I can't control my own behavior, I need a police to force my behavior, to conform to civil society. That's the balance. Our founders understood and recognized a human nature that was often self-indulgent, or I only cared about myself. I mean, this is the whole basis of Adam Smith's economics, right? It's the same thing in morality. Self-government starts with me alone. How can we maintain freedom without total control over society if we lose the capacity for self-government, beginning with the individual? Madison put it this way, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. You know, this is just the opposite of Karl Marx, the atheist, right? His goal was absolutely no government is necessary because we can perfect man. Now understand the difference here. The difference, if you believe in the sinful nature of mankind over the goodness of man because he's just a random chance act process of natural evolution, then what makes man do bad things? If it doesn't come from within here, it has to come out there. So you remove all the guns, and there won't be any more need, there won't be any crime, right? Wrong! It doesn't work that way. But that's the worldview driving the people who want to control all of our environment. Redistribute wealth, there will be no need to steal, right? Poverty causes crime, right? Well, if that were true, then wealth must cause integrity. Anybody know any wealthy criminals? Does Enron strike a bell? You know, the model doesn't work, but this is what the social people want. They want to control our environment to perfect man so no government will be necessary. That's what Marxism is all about. That's why Marxism has never existed. Russia was always fascist. It was never communist. That's why the professors at the university still think it hasn't been tried. They just think it hasn't been tried yet. It always leads to fascism because it doesn't work, because it's based on a faulty understanding of man's nature. Our founders had the program right. That's why it works. John Quincy Adams said the Declaration of Independence proclaimed the first principles on which civil government is founded, but it left the people without organized government. See, the British thought anarchy was going to be possible. But Adams went on to tell us, but there was no anarchy. Why? Because from the day of the Declaration, the people of North America were bound by the laws of God, which they all, and by the laws of the gospel, which they nearly all acknowledged as the rules of their conduct. We were self-governing, capable citizens when we threw off the restraint of a tyrannical government. In fact, this was so important that they put it in the spelling books. The people who should choose their best and wisest men for legislators, but it's the duty of every good man to inspect the moral conduct of the man who is offered as a legislator at our yearly elections. If people wish for good laws, they may have them by electing good men. Now, what do we hear today? Oh, that's his private life. That have no bearing on his public service. Well, the heck it doesn't. If he's going to lie to his wife, why wouldn't he lie to me, who he doesn't even know? That's our duty, to inspect the moral character of those we want to place in office. The third pillar is knowledge, and of course, wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. Cobb's sequel to the Juvenile Readers summed it up for us, that this work is calculated to allure the tender mind to the love of knowledge and the practice of virtue and religion, to inform the understanding. Education owns obedience to nothing but the truth, and the truth in both a political and moral sense makes men free. Where have we heard that before? The truth will make you free. You see, these ideas came from the same source. Our founders got the ideas for our future government, and it's worked for these 200 years. Why are we going to throw them out? Now I'm giving you the history of education. In the 60s, religion, the true source of liberty, law, and justice in America, was banned from our schools. In the 70s and 80s, morality, the basis for the great experiment in self-government, was replaced by postmodernism or moral relativism. In the 90s, knowledge of the truth, the intellectual basis of freedom itself, was replaced by outcome-based education for the purpose of transforming America. Why? To prepare for this millennia, where American education policy mandates sustainable development standards, curriculum, and assessments in all schools in this nation. Now, I'm not going to go through this too much because we've done it before, but No Child Left Behind is continuing to fund the Center for Civic Education out of the University of California, that tells us on their website, in the past century, the civic mission of schools was education for democracy in a sovereign state. In this century, by contrast, education will become everywhere more global and international, and we ought to improve our curricular frameworks and standards by a world transformed by globally accepted and internationally transcendent principles. This is the goal of our civic education policy in America. The Center for Civic Education holds the contract for the standards, the model textbook curriculum, and the NAEP assessment. It's all about global citizenship. And as Mike pointed out, I'm just going to go real quick here. The Bill of Rights is defined as negative rights in this book. It's doubtful, it says, that the founders had in mind an uncritical acceptance of the wisdom of the past. It is within the sovereign authority of the American people to revise or abolish entirely their Bill of Rights. What do they promote? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights as positive rights, because instead of preventing the government from acting, they require it to act, to ensure such things as economic security, health care, and a clean environment for its citizens. Folks, these are the very things we are assessing our students to see if they believe now that these things are government responsibility. And the curriculum is working the way it was meant to work because of it. The missing question in this textbook is, where do rights come from under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Do you know we've moved from a creator-given to a government-given rights? Article 29 tells us that these rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Now, once government becomes the arbiter of our rights, citizenship then means total allegiance to the state. And that is exactly how they define citizenship in the glossary of terms. One who owes allegiance to the government, and rights simply become a government entitlement. Folks, this is exactly Adolf Hitler's definition of citizenship. And it is now U.S. government policy. Note this live test from Minnesota on the role of government. The term sovereignty refers to the absolute authority a government has over its citizens. This was marked a correct answer. Are they talking about the United States? Yes, they are. This is considered false. The United States is not neither the United States nor Russia are sovereign states. The child's answer False, because our government has absolute authority over the citizens. This is marked correct. Folks, 20 million children have now taken this curriculum. The Army is poised against us. How do you prepare children to accept such ideas? Take away a people's heritage and they're easily persuaded. Thank you, and God bless us all.